The Oversight and Government Reform Committee will come to order, and we will resume where we had left off. And I believe it's now in order to recognize the gentleman from California, the former chairman of this committee, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've listened to both sides on this issue, and in an unusual way of trying to explain my position, I find merit in both sides. I do not personally support the law that allows physician-assisted suicide in my home state or in the District of Columbia. But that's not what we're debating here today. It is not for us to make a decision as to a law that we like or dislike. It's a question of whether or not the District of Columbia has exceeded its home rule mandate. And on that, I come up short of finding so. Let me please explain this. 6 states, including California, Colorado, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington, have already made a similar decision. My understanding is that the District of Columbia chose to pattern theirs after, I believe, Oregon. Now, there's no question here today that the District of Columbia made a decision not first, and from what I can tell, not in conflict with any prevailing Federal law. And I think that's an important distinction that will guide my further consideration on this resolution and any future one. Are we willing, as a nation, to use the power of legislation to provide guidance or a prohibition on some act? In the case of marijuana, it remains illegal in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the territories. While some states have chosen to strip away their laws, they have not changed the question of legality of marijuana. In this case, with the exception of funding, I can find no laws that would prohibit this activity. I do find it interesting, and I'll note it here tonight, in my state, we have found that you can safely and painlessly put yourself to death. But if somebody murders your family, we have not found a way to safely and allow them to be put to death. And that perhaps should be a topic for my legislators in California. So I'd like to use the remainder of my time to provide a guidance for after tonight. The late Henry Hyde, his name is still synonymous with the Hyde Amendment. It's still synonymous with respect for life. Some decade or so ago, Henry and I were at a California Right to Life gathering. Individuals there talked about saving every child's life. Henry, a strong advocate for using every effort to, in fact, save lives, without trying to chastise the supporters, defined life in a different way. He said, "We are all born and we will all die. The time and place of that death is unknown. What we do know is that a civilized society must show respect for life, that the consternation, the due process, the hand-wringing that goes over life and death decisions, not just in physician-assisted suicide, not just in the pro-life, pro-choice debate, not just in the death penalty, but in sending men and women to defend their country, in the decision about whether or not police can do certain things or can't do certain things. Throughout our society, we constantly measure the importance of life, even mandating seat belts, whether you like it or not, is about trying to save lives. So I would ask all my colleagues, regardless of how you're going to vote tonight, to ask the question, have we really, as a Federal government, asked the question for the 6 states that already allow physician-suicide, have we looked at the due process? Have we looked at the efficacy of how it's being done? And if we ask the question, if we're going to ask a question on life, Have we shown and caused our states and the District of Columbia to show the respect for life in this process? And so, Mr. Chairman, I do not believe that we have reached the required level of federal action to support repealing this, but not because I agree with it, but because I think our inaction in other areas should be considered in addition to whatever we do here tonight. And I want to thank the Chairman for his understanding and a little extra time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very, very briefly, myself, this is clearly a matter that was envisioned by the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. As the previous speaker noted, the gentleman from California, this is not outside the bounds of local purview. Indeed, the District Council has had full and robust debate about this. 70 witnesses. They've considered the issue much more thoroughly than we have here, I must admit. The way I see the Home Rule Act and the way the Constitution gives us authority in all cases whatsoever regarding the federal district, it comes down to this. If the District of Columbia were trying to, for instance, take federal land, let's say, that was dedicated towards national defense or homeland security, and use it for a local purpose, that would clearly be in violation of the Constitution and the very idea that Congress has final say. But this is a case where the District Council has considered local rights just as these other 6 states have, and they've made a very thorough decision. Now, I don't think we have to get to the merits of this issue. I think it is merely procedural whether we respect the rights of the District Council to consider this matter or not, just as we have those 6 other states. So I think we should uphold the decision and process that the D.C. Council has undertaken. I think that the disapproving the resolution of disapproval, I will vote against it. And with that, I will yield my remaining 3 minutes to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Before she does that, if I'd ask unanimous consent to give Ms. Norton a full 5 minutes as you yield to her. Without objection, so ordered.
I thank the chairman for his courtesy. I do want to correct the record in at least a couple of respects. I can understand that members cannot possibly be as familiar with this matter as the district is, which spent considerable time with it. I don't want you to believe that this would not be an agonizing decision, but with some education, with some understanding, for example, that there had been no reported abuses, and with testimony from residents asking for this remedy. During the debate, there was alleged what amounts to a notion that the district did not want to let the underlying cause be known. What the district did was to look for consistency. How do we treat matters involving withdrawal or refusal of medical treatment, or even the use of palliative sedation? That's not on the death certificate. What's on the death certificate is the underlying disease. So all the district did was to do what it does with refusal of medical treatment that happens every day, palliative sedation, which happens at the hands of physicians, and this bill does not involve physicians participating in the taking of life. On medical records, and I certainly must correct the record that somehow this matter happens in camera and nobody gets any review of it. The District Department of Health is required to collect information on anyone who participates in the Death with Dignity Act. DC enforcement agencies and other government agencies have access to medical records for patients who participate, the same as they do for any other patient. The chief medical examiner reviews each death under the bill. And if warranted, the chief medical examination can call for an investigation. I suspect that this was the case in the other bills and the other jurisdictions, and that is to say that there could have been an investigation, and that may tell us why we have no reported instances of abuse by the parties involved. And I certainly believe that physicians who are involved would not want to be party to such an abuse. I appreciate the opportunity to correct the record.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was mentioned, I think, by the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell, about what's going on in Holland. I'd like to point out just a few things. I don't intend to consume the entire amount of my time, but I do want to point out that since Holland adopted assisted suicide, that it has tripled since 2002. 1 of every 28 deaths in Holland are now physician-assisted suicide. And it's being reported, and it's been reported for several years now, that many of these are without consent. It's a physician decision. I'd like to point out that the Oregon Health Plan denied a patient coverage for cancer treatment, but offered to cover their suicide pills instead. I just would also like to point out that Washington, D.C. has a suicide prevention hotline. If suicide is an option, if we take this approach, why have a prevention line? I mean, why have a psychiatric center for the suicidal? Why have the police intervene in somebody who's made a decision to take their life, to talk them off the ledge? And I know that you may say that that's not consistent with this, but it is. And then the thing that concerns me is where this is leading, and it was mentioned about palliative care, that you get to a point where the cost of preserving a life at the end of life is so expensive that a decision is made rather than try to provide curative care. You just make the patient comfortable, or you offer them a suicide pill. University of Michigan did a study, Mr. Chairman, that showed that half of the Medicare patients involved in the study, their cost was many times higher in the last year of life. It was over $59,000. And it concerns me that if we go down this road, that we will get to a point where decisions will be made about whether or not people can get care at all. They'll be given the option to take their life or to be made comfortable. And then the last thing I want to say is you talked about your dad, Mr. Chairman, your mom. My dad was chronically ill as well. And I prayed for him like many of you have prayed for your family members. I prayed that God would let him see 80 years. He let him see 87. I'd give anything if he could have given him a few more. I come from a faith perspective that I know not everyone in here shares. I understand that. But I come from a perspective that you are all made in the image and likeness of God. You were fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm looking at people that are loved. I'm looking at people that love. I'm looking at people that have value. So that's my perspective. I'm not looking at anybody in here that we don't need. I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yielded my time.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, for 5 minutes. Did I get it right?
Perfect.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to speak briefly. I believe that this particular resolution deserves a death with dignity. I think that I think there should be two guiding principles, and I really respect everything that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have presented with regard to this particular resolution, and I take them at their word that they sincerely hold these beliefs. But in this particular case, I think there are two questions that we should ask. One, is this law within the power of the District of Columbia to legislate within? And the answer is yes. And two, is this within the mainstream? Is it between the 40-yard lines of what is considered to be acceptable legislation in the United States of America? And the answer is obviously yes. We have 5 states that have already passed such legislation, and one was court-ordered, and the United States Supreme Court has also said this is constitutional. So in this instance, rather than us seeking to replace the views, however sincerely held we may have those views, replacing the views of those legislators in the District of Columbia with our own, we should allow them to make their own laws in this regard, especially in as sensitive a topic as this. So again, I say that HJ Resolution 27 should suffer a death with dignity and allow it to go away. Thank you so much.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to correct, and I'm not sure where the gentleman was from, who left the impression that chemotherapy had been denied, but instead death with dignity had been recommended. In the 2 instances he spoke of, that was not the case. The patient asked for experimental chemotherapy and was told that it would not work with him. And the discussion of his options, it is true that one of those related to him was not only death with dignity, I think this was an Oregon matter, but other types of end-of-life and palliative care. So no one was trying to induce this man to do death with dignity or palliative care or the rest of it, but he was denied the use of an experimental drug, and that's altogether different. All of these instances really need some discussion in context, and I thank the gentleman for yielding and yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back, gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish, gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on the bill? Does any member have an amendment to the bill? Hearing none, I move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report HJ Resolution 27 to the House with the recommendation that the resolution do pass. If there's no further discussion, the question is on favorably reporting House Joint Resolution 27 to the House. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Roll call vote has been requested. Sufficient number of members having requested, a roll call vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chaffetz.
Aye.
Mr. Chaffetz votes yes. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Issa. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Sanford. Mr. Amash. Mr. Gosar. Mr. Desjardins. Mr. Gowdy. Mr. Farenthold. Mr. Farenthold votes yes. Ms. Fox. Yes. Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Massey. Yes. Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Meadows. Mr. DeSantis. Mr. DeSantis votes yes. Mr. Ross. Aye. Mr. Ross votes yes. Mr. Walker. Aye. Mr. Walker votes yes. Mr. Blum. Mr. Heiss. Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell votes yes. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd votes yes. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes yes. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings votes no. Ms. Maloney. Ms. Norton. Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes yes. Mr. Connolly.
No, never.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence. Ms. Lawrence votes no. Ms. Watson Coleman. Ms. Watson Coleman votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Ms. Plaskett votes no. Ms. Demings. Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy. Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright votes no. Mr. Desaulniers. Mr. Desaulniers votes no.
We have some members who are making their way to the vote, so we'll hold this for a moment.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
We're in the middle of a vote here.
I know, I was just going to ask if a tie vote fails. Is that right?
We haven't finished the vote yet. Gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Mr. Issa votes no.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Jordan votes yes.
Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Mr. Gosar votes yes.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins votes yes.
Gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Sanford. Am I recorded? How are you recorded?
Mr. Sanford is not recorded. Yes. Mr. Sanford votes yes.
The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Amash.
Mr. Amash votes yes.
Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss.
Mr. Heiss votes yes.
Gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Mr. Duncan votes yes.
Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer.
Mr. Palmer votes yes.
Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Blum.
Mr. Blum votes yes.
Any other member who wishes to be recorded who has not been recorded? Clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, there are 22 yeas and 14 nays.
The ayes have it, and the resolution is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection pursuant to Clause 2L of House Rule 11, members will have 2 days to submit their views on the resolution considered today. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Committee stands adjourned.